they didn't have to be better than you in order to get the job. And I know you really want to think that like all you have to do is be better. All you have to do is, work harder and, be smarter, and then you'll have what they have. But baby, that's not how they got it.
Hey everyone, it's Chelsea Fagan, and welcome back to The Financial Diet. When it comes to talking about privilege as a concept, it's gone from being a relatively obscure topic to being the ideological battlefield on which countless culture wars are currently being fought. Montage of news clips about various privileges. On one side, you have the quote-unquote woke mob, of which I'm a proud member, honey, pointing out that our lives are often just as determined by our lottery of demographics at birth as by our merit. And on the other, you have hard-working Americans, or whatever other euphemism is being used for conservatives at any given time, pushing back on the idea that your race, religion, gender, sexuality, or any other aspect of your identity could possibly have an impact on the outcomes of your life.
If you were a black gay man saying liberal things, there's no way they'd tolerate any of this against you, right? But they're the ones perpetrating it against you because you happen to lean conservative.
America is now a place where if you work hard, get educated, and an honest person, you can succeed.
This wimpy man that we're producing, and I'm not even talking about just wimpy men, but wimpy women, everyone's offended all the time. It's not attractive.
Society's too tolerant. We got too tolerant. And so now what you're seeing is an overcorrection. And so maybe we're having some issues with real hate now.
I'm a minority, but I don't have a minority mindset. I don't need special privileges, I don't need affirmative action, and I don't need diversity quotas.
How about the idea that if you're a woman, that you're at some sort of inherent disadvantage here in the United States? No, you're not.
Even if some of the biggest pundits occasionally dip their own toes into the choppy waters of identity politics when it suits their argument. But whether we're actually making meaningful progress along various axes of privilege since the rise and ubiquity of privileged discourse, and that is debatable and varies depending on which exact type of privilege you're talking about, one thing is very clear. A culture war that almost never gets fought in the public discourse is one of the arguably most defining privileges in American life, and that is class privilege. There are a lot of reasons for this, and we will of course break them down, but perhaps one of the reasons that class privilege doesn't get discussed quite at the same level as other privileges is because from the earliest ages in this country, we are absolutely steeped in a culture of wealth envy. Exposed to levels of consumer and material accumulation that basically were only ever enjoyed by kings prior to this generation. That famous quote about Americans always thinking of themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires rarely feels more true than when you're consuming media and pop culture. Because put simply, if you were just to look around our media landscape in America, you would think that we live in a capitalist utopia. Don't believe me? Well, take a look.
They have the whole world at their disposal.
We're making a name for ourselves.
I'm just wondering if I can hit you for like a little 100 mil.
The lifestyle that everybody kind of wants.
I want to rob.
Just go shopping. That's the best therapy.
Join the billionaire's daughter on her jet.
I'm just curious what the price range is.
52, 53 million.
This is like the main area.
It's huge.
Huge retractable TV.
Oh, wow. Okay. Whoa, this is crazy.
You should have started that spa for poor women with that girl from Maui.
Maybe Will just isn't cut out for this.
Stop it! I can handle it.
Oh my God.
You gotta do this more often.
Oh, that's just giving me goosebumps. Look, Pamela. Oh, no.
And our obsession with wealth and success, and our subtle feeling that we are meant to be one of those people, makes total sense in the context of our first chapter, The Myth of the American Dream. It's worth noting that even if we weren't so totally surrounded by narratives of wealth and success at the highest levels, we would still have a problem assessing our own economic reality in America because even the representations we see of the quote-unquote middle class are completely out of step with the current reality. Think shows like The Simpsons, Friends, Modern Family, Sex and the City, cultural touchstones that purport to represent what normal Americans look like, or even in the case of someone like a Carrie Bradshaw, a person who's barely making any money. And look look at the homes they live in, the cars they drive, the amount of children they're able to support on one salary. Not only are the images we're seeing every day of what normal American life is supposed to look like totally inaccurate, we are also often raised with an innate understanding that class disparities are more than anything a reflection of work ethic, and that if we were all willing to do enough, we could be like those images we see.
It seems like nobody wants to work these days.
And that subtle idea that you might at any time be able to change your class keeps us from really seeing class as the identity category that it is. For most liberals and progressives, it's easy to accept other identities as being privileged or underprivileged because, among other things, they're usually things that can't be changed, like someone's race, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. But even among those who lean left politically, poverty is often seen as an individual issue rather than a systemic one, and the same can be said for ultra-wealth. But when you look at the raw numbers compared to most developed countries, for as much as the American dream centers on the idea that we're able to change our financial standing with unusual ease, we're actually way behind. We tend to fall behind almost all other developed countries in terms of class mobility, and studies show that even by our own standards, mobility has vastly decreased since 1980. You might be thinking, well, what's the elephant in that room? And to that I say, Ronald Reagan. We'll do a video on him soon. Now, I would be dishonest here not to speak on my own personal experience as one of the relatively few Americans who did change her social class. I grew up low income and am now, even by New York City standards, upper middle class. I won't totally discount the fact that I have worked hard throughout my life, but it's worth noting that many people, including many people in my own personal life, work just as hard or harder than I do and still remain lower income. For example, my mother, but also many other women in my family, are or were public school teachers, and few people would doubt that that is a profession that demands an enormous amount of not just actual work hours, but compassion, emotional labor, and personal dedication to the job. And yet, in many states, they're so severely underpaid that they can't even keep teachers employed. In some states, you'd literally be better off working at a gas station financially. And when you look at the particulars of my situation, I have no college degree, I'm a woman, and we typically earn less. I am self-employed and started my own small business, the vast majority of which fail, and I moved to a high cost of living area. By demographic standards, I should not have changed class. And as you saw in the cold open, I didn't just want to talk about my own experience here. I also sat down with my personal friend and friend of TFD, Ashley C. Ford, who not only, like me, grew up low income, but had even more layers of demographic hurdles to overcome. She's first of all a Black woman, but also had one of two parents incarcerated for the majority of her life. She now, against all odds, finds herself wealthy today and has a lot of incredible insights on the subject.
I was born poor. Pretty poor. My mom was a single parent of two by the time I was two. She was not a single parent when I was born because her and my father were married, but then my father went to prison when I was about 6 months old and obviously provided no income to our family for the rest of my childhood, well into my adulthood. So we were just super poor. My mom worked. I was not living in the kind of poverty where I was hungry most days. Most days I ate and was able to find food fairly easily that did not all the time or even regularly come from my kitchen, but we figured it out. And then I went to college and on a lot of grants, loans, and scholarships, I was able to pay for college. After I left college, I had 3 jobs that were part-time at the same time for a little while, lost all 3 of those jobs, and decided to start giving writing a shot while I was working full-time as an administrator for a marketing company. I was still, maybe working class at that point, definitely not even lower middle class or middle class. I couldn't afford a car, could not afford to do anything that was not, like just above surviving and trying to have fun in your mid-20s. And then I moved to New York, and that's when things sort of changed for me. Right now, just looking at what I made last year, gross, and what I was able to bring home from the business that is me, combined with my husband's income, we would probably be classified as upper middle class.
And even back to my own story, which did start with considerably more advantages than Ashley's, I still needed a lottery win's worth of good luck in order to reach the place I did financially. Not only did John and Hank Green fall out of the sky with money and the resources to start a YouTube channel when we were just starting the financial diet. Full disclosure, not only did they co-start our YouTube channel with us, they also at the very outset of our company gave us a $5,000 grant to invest. But I also had a husband who has been gainfully employed the entire time that I was on my entrepreneurial journey and was able to not only help cover bills, but also keep me on his health insurance for the 2+ year stretch where I wasn't able to have my own. And while I still could have theoretically changed my social class if I had stayed in my previous career trajectory and not started a business, my last job capped out at $42,000 a year in my last year, and by New York standards, that is barely a living wage. Though I should note, still unusual for not having a college degree. But in general, barring some truly good luck combined with the right work at the right time, the class you're born into in America is the class you're likely to stay in or stay close to, and that is true at both the top and bottom of the wealth spectrum. Because this is another important thing to remember every time people make character or work ethic assumptions about the wealthy, especially the ultra-wealthy. Most people in this country were born that way to some degree, with only 27% of wealthy Americans meeting the definition of self-made, according to one study. But when it comes to the reality of working with the wealthy up close and personal every day, few people are better equipped to talk about it than another friend of mine and friend of TFD's, Amanda Holden, aka Dumpster Doggy. For those who don't know, she is an investment educator now, but she used to be an investment manager for the rich.
I wasn't working with people that inherited billions. I wasn't working with like the Waltons. That being said, wealth is almost always accumulated across generations. And this is due to a large number of cultural and political factors. So, for example, I worked with a lot of family business owners. That requires having a family with a business, having parents that started a successful business. Doctors who did really well for themselves and would likely see themselves as self-made, of course, ignoring the massive head starts that they were given in life. Our client base was predominantly white men of retirement age. So I was working in finance 10 years ago. So this was boomers and the silent generation. And whiteness and maleness have been two of the all-time greatest financial privileges that you could have, especially if you were born in, say, 1930 or 1950. And so there was a real reason that we did not, for example, have very many Black clients or independently wealthy women clients. And so our clients often had massive political privilege and the privilege of lucky timing, which is something that is becoming more popular to talk about as millennials look to how boomers got so successful without any added or additional effort. The reasons are lucky timing. They could get college for close to nothing or nothing. Modest salaries, could afford houses. Their house values and stock market portfolios have exploded in ways we probably won't see again.
But perhaps no one issue is more relevant to our lack of class mobility in this country than just how unbelievably expensive it is to be poor. Chapter 2, being poor, the ultimate luxury good. To say that poverty is expensive in America is to undersell it. Nearly every single aspect of life has a tax or premium on it when you have to navigate it as a poor person. Just to name a few. The inability to buy in bulk or at bulk prices, because there's almost always a discount to buying multiples of something at once, but you need both the cash up front and the space to store those items. Shopping at low-cost outlets like dollar stores, which often put markups on individually portioned, smaller-sized items, in addition to all of the other indignities of dollar stores. I highly recommend the John Oliver segment on this issue in particular. Simple fines that can easily and quickly be paid by wealthier people, but will snowball when you can't afford to pay into catastrophic financial and legal situations. For those who may not know, my arrest many years ago stemmed from unpaid moving violations. Shout out to not driving anymore. The inability to afford down payments or deposits for housing, often leading to needing temporary housing, which is often charged by the day and incredibly expensive. Payday lenders that charge exorbitant fees and interests, pay-as-you-go, rent-to-own, or layaway programs that can often hugely increase the actual cost of an item. But don't take it from me. We went out and spoke to a person who is themselves currently living at the poverty line.
everyone in college, they always kind of joke around that like, oh, like we're in college and everyone's broke. But whenever like I kind of like try to explain my situation to some of my peers who grew up in more of like a high income household, or who have parents who earn two and who like have two incomes, and like their parents are willing to drop like 2, 3, 500 as like an allowance for them a month while they're at college, they don't really get it in a way. They have like a very specific idea of what like poverty looks like. I guess especially for like Cincinnati and like in that urban setting of like, well, how can you be poor? Like you're not sleeping on the streets. Like how can you be like you're fine, like, and that kind of thing. It's a lot of very, and I know like a lot of them mean well, but it's just a lot of like, well, why can't you just like get a job? Like, why can't your parents just bail you out? Like, why can't you this? Why can't you that? So I think that's been like a really hard thing for me financially. In addition to like a lot of like social activities in college, but I guess like in general, just because of the society we live in are very like consumer based, are very money based, like, oh, let's go to Starbucks, or oh, let's like go to a movie, or let's like get on a bus and go to like downtown or something like that. Or like those are like an example of some of the most expensive parts of being poor for me, in addition to just like not having the luxury to think about the future, I guess, as opposed to like some of my other more well-off classmates and peers, if that makes sense. Like I know that like buying, like for example, buying like a annual subscription versus like a monthly subscription, that's like that's cheaper in the long run, but in the immediate it's not. So like it is going to be more expensive in the long run, but I can't really think about that because I need to think about how much is in my checking account, which is like not a lot. I think currently it's like I think $12 or $11 at the moment, with like no savings at all.
In fact, by expert estimates, escaping poverty demands 20 years, not just of healthy financial management, but nothing going wrong in your life in order to escape poverty. That means no unexpected illnesses or medical events, no accidents, car wrecks, insurance issues, no deaths in the family that need to be cared for, no unexpected layoffs and job loss. Essentially, you need to spend 20 years being like Mario Kart when he's like that flashing magic nothing can hurt me thing. What is that called?
I don't know.
I don't know.
One of the ways that you realize when you have that class transition that nobody really expects people to exceed the class that they were born into is that you realize that all the people around you were prepared to indulge in certain things. They were prepared to experience certain luxuries of life in a way that you were taught was a fantasy. Even in terms of things like now, if I need to fly somewhere, if something happened to someone in my family, if a friend said, hey, I need you, can you be here? There's nothing stopping me from booking a flight right now. And I can decide when I want to get that flight. I can decide when I want it to bring me back. I could go somewhere and decide while I'm there that I need to return on a different day. And whatever costs are associated with that, I can just eat them very, very easily. And these were things that I didn't really understand were available when I was growing up. I didn't get on a plane for the first time until I was 19. My mother has never been on a plane. I compare that to somebody like my husband who grew up very differently, and how when we started dating, one of the things that was really, really, really apparent to me, as far as like our class differences, was his ease with travel versus mine. His ability to sort of be like, things might happen, but we'll figure them out, versus my incredible fear that if anything went wrong, we would be stuck, because I only knew being stuck in your circumstances. I didn't know about the flexibility of being able to respond when there is suddenness, emergency, crisis, in a way that would not be a detriment to me. Not just by maybe being stuck, but also maybe like, if I paid a change of flight, can I afford my rent next month? Those are not questions for me anymore. And that has been like a really tangible experience for me, specifically with travel, what that is, what that feels like when you are in a different class. And also, again, that some people were prepared for that. Some people got to experience that a lot. They got to make all the travel mistakes when they were kids that I was making in my 20s and 30s.
In America, not only is poverty hugely impactful on our day-to-day lives, it's also often very visible. We'll be speaking in more detail in an upcoming video essay on the aesthetics of poverty and how often just looking poor keeps us from advancing in our class status. But one of the more insidious things about wealth is how often it can go unnoticed. Chapter 3, The Scourge of Stealth Wealth. As I mentioned in the intro, along with the movies and TV shows that glamorize extreme wealth, we also have to look at how wealth and class infect almost every aspect of the media and content we consume on a daily basis. But whether it's a quote-unquote middle-class family living in a mansion, or the billionaire failed children fighting it out on Succession, it's more accurate to say that a specific kind of wealth is what we see, because at some level it's intended to be visible. Now, some people might frame this simply as new versus old money, but I actually think it's a little bit more blurred and insidious than that. We actually did a recent video on the topic of old money aesthetic and stealth wealth, and I'll reference that point. The average person is never even going to come in contact with the kind of people who can afford to wear subtle, discreet designer wardrobes that they can treat like garbage, while they pull into their slip at their yacht club with the schooner that's been in their family for decades. Unless, of course, like my former self, they happen to be working for them. But it makes total sense that as we get further and further away from these ideals, we become more and more fascinated with them. As one Harper's Bazaar article put it, the term old money and the lifestyle and status that come with it has been a point of fascination for decades. The secret lives and unspoken codes of the obscenely wealthy have served as a backdrop for countless films and television shows, inspired many a novel, and in essence been the gold standard of what one can achieve under capitalism. For the most part, it was a lifestyle that lived in the realm of dreams, under the guise of if you work hard enough, you too can live like this. And now the ideal of old money has hit the eyes of younger generations thanks to social media. In short, this recent rise in young people's infatuation with exorbitant wealth feels paradoxically at odds with and also symptomatic of a period of economic instability. Several economic theories may be able to explain Gen Z's move into a more demure style and subsequent shift away from the glitzy Y2K looks. For example, in 1926, economist George Taylor coined the hemline index, theorizing that women's skirts get shorter during times of financial prosperity and longer in a recession. Essentially, stealth wealth is a means of self-presentation by the wealthy that is intended to at least somewhat obscure the extent of their riches, but to subtly convey that wealth in a way that's generally only clockable by other wealthy people. And this hyperfixation on the different levels of visibility with wealth have become their own phenomenon in and of itself. I mean, you can barely use TikTok anymore without coming across this stuff on your For You page. But it's important to understand that this perception of stealth wealth as simply another aesthetic that the rich will wear kind of misses the point. Yes, that is true in some cases, and there are certain strata of the uber wealthy who go out of their way to seem less ostentatious than they really are. But what I consider to be a more insidious form of stealth wealth is just how present it is all around us in ways that are not quite being hidden per se, but are never being disclosed. To take it back to TikTok, there was a recent trend of showing aspects of your life and home over a little audio, talking about how you like this little life, At its inception, I imagine it was intended to show a cozy and relatable snapshot of people's lives and homes, but it quickly exploded into showing things like extremely nice vacations, beautifully restored colonial homes, fancy picnics, Macy's window-level Christmas decorations, and other levels of opulence that show that wealth is so normalized that we're all just supposed to equate these objectively expensive and hyper-consumerist lifestyles as little lives. In fact, it's even become its own counter-discourse on TikTok, with people sharing about how they didn't realize that people's little lives included things like multiple luxury vehicles or an in-ground pool. And on social media, you can also look at literally any home organization or restocking TikTok. Restocking videos are a subgenre in and of themselves, which generally both provide a sort of ASMR relaxation factor, but also a more acceptable form of wealth porn. Because ultimately, these endless videos of pantries and massive refrigerators full of single-use plastics, often that are being transferred into other more aesthetically pleasing plastic containers, obviously require an extraordinary level of financial ease. But because it's not showing you on a private jet or wearing head-to-toe designer clothes, it feels more accessible and relatable to a middle-class reality. If the lifestyle influencers going to Paris Fashion Week are the White Lotus of social media, then the pantry restocking videos are Gilmore Girls. They're theoretically showing you a life that you can understand and relate to, but everything about it is barely coded stealth wealth. But speaking of Gilmore Girls, fans of the show might remember that the story culminated for Rory Gilmore in her going off to Yale, which was not just seen as an academic achievement, but also a social achievement. Being raised by a single mother in what was ostensibly intended to be a more relatable middle-class lifestyle, getting to the Ivy League would be no small feat. Which brings us to Chapter 4, the Ivy League, the ultimate show horse of the wealthy. So we dove into this topic in a video exclusive to our society members, so do go join and check that video out in its entirety. But as we learned with this summer's Supreme Court decision, in the eyes of many Americans, affirmative action gives certain groups of people an unfair advantage when it comes to things like access to an elite higher education. But in reality, it's the ultra-wealthy who have the unfair advantage here. From a 2017 article on CNBC, at 38 colleges in America, including 5 in the Ivy League, more students came from the top 1% of the income scale than from the entire bottom 60%. And the same New York Times article being cited here also points out that at every one of the top 65 US universities, the median parent income is over $100,000. That figure ranges from $272,000 at Washington University in St. Louis to $104,900 at UCLA. Not the broke boys at UCLA, yikes. When it comes to the concept of stealth wealth, i.e. being able to sort of subtly infiltrate society without having to completely disclose your wealth, elite educations are excellent laundering tools for turning what was already class advantage into seeming meritocracy. Because if you're wealthy enough in America, you can almost literally pay your way into any school you want. And then once you go to that school, you're able to highlight that education as more contributing to your success than the wealth that got you there in the first place. Jared Kushner. And part of the reason for this, outside of the outright string pulling that was obviously hugely impactful in Jared Kushner's situation, and is often the resource that the wealthy have to pull on the most, rich kids are able to pad their applications with all kinds of prestigious extracurriculars that are literally not even accessible to the majority of Americans. They can have private tutors and coaches. They can be on boards and form nonprofits even as a teenager. They can sink countless hours into music and art and performance. Basically, they are able to develop themselves as a well-rounded individual in the eyes of university applications, not just because they have the resources necessary to pay for those extracurriculars and to have the appropriate coaching or mentorship, but also because they literally have the time to do it. And few people are better positioned to speak on this particular topic than Ashley.
But I was talking to one of my mom friends recently, and she was telling me about the difference. She used to live in a place where it was like a highly competitive school district, like, really expensive, like private schools, all their students going to Ivies and, blah, 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 whatever. And then there was she moved into this other school system that's actually about half the shrinking middle class and then half working class. There's a lot more, you get a lot more kind of socioeconomic diversity over there. And she said the difference between the two parent communities at these schools was so stark that she feels like she would never ever live in a competitive school district ever again, because the working class parents, middle class, and then some of the lower like living in poverty, blah, 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 like all of those parents, they work together. They're all working together for the whole student body. But everybody on the wealthy end was there trying to show up and work for their kids specifically because they don't need anything from each other. They don't need anything from each other. And when you don't need anything from each other in a community, which a lot of people I think strive for some reason, but what essentially ends up happening is that the only thing to connect you is competition. That's it. So the parents are in so much competition with each other that they can't build a community that's for like the good of the school. Everything has to be, okay, no, we already got everything for the school. What else could these kids need? How do I make sure my kid beats your kid that also has all of the advantages?
I don't know about you guys, but I had to work as a teenager. We tend to forget, but especially at the much lower end of the economic spectrum, children are even expected to contribute to the household finances. I was lucky in that the jobs that I held as a teenager were for my own college fund and spending money. But for many American kids, the idea of being able to sink any time, let alone tons of time, into these extracurriculars is basically unthinkable, because many are just focused on getting by financially. Which is ironic when you consider Chapter 5, Rich People, the ultimate welfare queens. When we see the poor as having unfair advantages and the rich as being self-made, it's easy to ignore the reality that rich people likely benefit from welfare more than the poor. But before we even dive into that, let's remind ourselves that a lot of strides in progressive legislation ultimately benefited the upper or upper middle classes first, before eventually making their way to the lower classes. Look at voting rights, for instance. Upon the founding of America, voting rights were only granted to white men, and specifically white men who owned property, until the 1820s. Black men were then technically granted the right to vote in 1870, but thanks to Jim Crow laws that made it prohibitively difficult for them to actually register to vote, this was suppressed until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws suppressed the vote for people of all races from poor backgrounds, with Black and Indigenous Americans being most affected. For example, some states enforced literacy tests for those who couldn't prove a 5th grade education, something that Americans of color were much less likely to have thanks to other Jim Crow laws limiting access to education. But let's say you're even able to vote, which again is not a given and historically has been out of reach of many Americans, especially poor and especially non-white. Put simply, the wealthy benefit much more from social programs and welfare than the poor do. For years, right-leaning politicians, starting with, of course, our best friend, Ronald Reagan, have rallied against, quote, welfare queens for mooching off of government assistance. This term and this entire image are so pervasive that it still heavily colors how most Americans think programs are distributed in this country. It's nearly impossible to reverse that concept that it's typically low-income women of color, and specifically Black women, that are disproportionately benefiting from these programs. But the reality is, just as they got voting rights, the rich have actually benefited a lot more from government assistance than so-called welfare queens from the poor and working classes. For one thing, welfare allows the wealthiest companies to pay their workers pennies while lining the pockets of owners and C-suite executives. Just one example from a 2018 Time magazine article, the Walton family of Walmart is the wealthiest family in the country with a net worth of over $160 billion. This one family has owned more wealth than the bottom 40% of Americans. Meanwhile, just like Amazon, Walmart pays its workers wages that are so inadequate that many of them are forced to depend on public assistance programs at a cost of some $6.2 billion a year to taxpayers in order to survive. These ultra-wealthy have been able to obtain their outsized level of wealth specifically because they exploit their workers, and they simply would not be quite as wealthy if they didn't help perpetuate poverty. The fact is that if employers in this country simply paid workers a living wage that has kept up with cost of inflation, taxpayers would save about $150 billion per year on federal assistance programs, and millions of workers would be able to live in dignity and security.
I'm currently in the process of applying for SSI for disability because I do have autism spectrum disorder. I was diagnosed when I was 10 years old. So I'm currently in the process of applying for that and seeing if that's going to be approved. I initiated the process in July of this year. So I'm aware that there are different welfare supports in place, but a lot of times it just can feel really overwhelming. For me, I guess, to like have to look at all like the requirements like on their website or something, and like find out how many forms I need to fill out, what documents everyone needs, and like if there's like extended responses, or like if there's like an essay I need to write or something like that to prove that like, hey, I'm struggling, could you help me out? Growing up, there was like that 2-year period where my family my family was on welfare support when my dad was unemployed. It was kind of an interesting situation. I guess like the attitude around money and finances and welfare was kind of weird in my household, because even though there were points where we were struggling, even though like even just being on like a single income household is like a struggle in and of itself, like in this economy. We also grew up for the majority of my life, like between birth and when I was about 16 years old, so like right before the pandemic. We grew up in this kind of like non-denominational, interdenominational Pentecostal mega church that was really like persistent about prosperity gospel. So a lot of the messaging that like we got about money growing up from our parents, they just like heard it from, you know, the pastor at that church. A lot of it was based off of like meritocracy and like, you know, if you're not like, if your finances are in order, or if you're in poverty, if you're in a tough spot, it's like it's just like your fault, and you're not working hard enough, you're not praying hard enough, fasting hard enough, or you're not tithing to our church enough. And once you start doing that, then God will bless you through your finances. So I think in terms of that, like welfare was kind of frowned down upon in that environment, because it was just seen as like a handout, and it was seen as like a form of weakness.
Something else that's very important to consider when it comes to how we even conceptualize who is receiving welfare and benefits in this country is that most people who are on some kind of public assistance do actually work. This idea of people sitting at home all day and mooching off the government is almost never the case. And when we rethink people taking government assistance as why are they even in need of that assistance in the first place when they're working often full-time jobs, we see just how much the wealthy are able to benefit from these programs existing at a much greater scale than the poor who depend on them. But another big government handout the ultra-rich benefits from, besides the capitalizing on welfare programs for their workers, is taking advantage of capital gains taxes. The tax on gains from investment is much lower than the highest income tax rate, which is currently 37%, with most people paying no more than a 15% tax on gains. When you consider that the annual earnings of the ultra-rich often includes more investment income than actual salary income, that means that they are effectively taxed lower than their tax bracket says they should be.
Let me tell you about how Peter Thiel uses a Roth IRA. So first, Peter Thiel, for anybody that does not know him, he is a venture capitalist. He started PayPal. He has been a major investor in Silicon Valley. He is also he's the goofball that both brought down Gawker and then also Silicon Valley Bank. And so he has quite the resume. And so how he used a Roth IRA. So perhaps first it would be good to state what a Roth IRA is. So a Roth IRA was designed to be a place for middle-class folks to save for retirement, and specifically save and invest for retirement. And there's a lot of confusion about what a Roth IRA is, but I think that this story might actually make it more clear. But what a Roth IRA is it's a tax shelter for investment growth. The entire point of using a Roth IRA or any retirement account is that when you have investment gains, you don't have to tell the IRS about it. And that's why they make sense to use for the long term, because this is a benefit that only grows as you invest successfully for a long period of time. Okay, so let's come back to Peter Thiel. So Peter Thiel, when he creates PayPal, and he at the time decides he gets to pick the value for what is one PayPal share worth. And he picks the value. He values his own shares at 1/10 of 1 penny apiece. This is likely fraudulent, but it's very hard to check, and the IRS is not going to go after him for this. And so at the valuation of 1/10 of 1 penny per share, what he is able to do is acquire many of his own shares for next to nothing. And so, for example, he buys 1.7 million PayPal shares, and at that value, it costs him $1,700, so nothing. He then moves those shares into a Roth IRA, and because $1,700 is less than the contribution maximum, it's totally fair game. Since then, those shares have exploded in value. He also does this with shares of other companies he has helped to fund or found, like Facebook. So it's rinse and repeat. He does this same thing over and over again. And cut to now, his Roth IRA is now worth $5 billion, and he will not have to pay taxes on any of it because all of this growth has happened inside the tax shelter that is a Roth IRA. I mean, it feels criminal, but so many of these tax strategies, which straddle the line between tax avoidance, which is technically legal, and tax evasion, which is technically illegal. And there's a lot of gray area.
And the wealthy have also found a zillion other ways to avoid taxes, from simply deducting things like golf meetings and charitable donations, to putting their money into industries with crazy tax breaks like oil and real estate, to literally paying their way into creating new laws benefiting themselves. Quote, for the billionaires who contributed millions to Republican politicians, the payoff came in the form of Trump's, quote, big, beautiful tax cut for pass-through businesses. ProPublica found that the change sent $1 billion in tax savings in a single year to just 82 ultra-wealthy households. But if benefiting from government programs and tax breaks wasn't enough, like a child on hour 3 of Monopoly, they just flipped the board. Chapter 6. How the rich buy their own laws. So it is no secret on this channel, or probably elsewhere, that the ultra-wealthy have an enormous influence on our political process, and that the ultra-wealthy are to some extent able to put in the legislation they want. The sobering reality is that lower-class interests are vastly underrepresented, both in our governing body and in the legislation that's passed. Quote, historically, when middle and upper middle income groups have aligned on issues, policies were enacted in Congress, but not when middle and lower income groups agreed. And though the bill passage rate is low in general, the interests of the wealthy and a few elites are reflected to a greater extent in bills throughout different stages of the legislative process. Working class interests are not only less likely to be adopted by Congress, but also representatives' desire to learn about these perspectives is limited. Campaign donors were 3 to 4 times more likely to get a meeting scheduled and to meet with higher-ranked congressional officials than non-campaign donors in a field experiment with U.S. Congress members. And there are recent wins from people with working-class backgrounds and sensibilities like AOC or Cori Bush, but they are still the exception to the rule. As of 2018, workers made up nearly half of U.S. citizens, but less than 10% of U.S. officials. And as of 2020, more than half of the members of Congress are millionaires. And one reason so many of them are millionaires is because they're bought by corporate interests.
Money, more than anything, means access. Money can be used to influence policy through both donations and via lobbying. The money used to influence policy, especially from corporations, is first put into political action committees, so PACs and super PACs, and then that money is used to buy influence. And so while there are limits to how much any one person or any one PAC can donate to a politician directly and specifically for their reelection campaigns, these PACs and super PACs are able to spend an unlimited amount of money on indirect methods of supporting a candidate, or a politician. So, for example, they could buy presumably unlimited ads running a massive smear campaign against candidates' opposition. So when a certain PAC or special interest group goes hard for a politician, what they get is then a direct line to that politician. And so that's the somewhat indirect way that corporate interests can buy lawmakers. I was actually just looking at this. So opensecrets.org is a really good resource for anybody that wants to look into who's spending the most lobby dollars and who has the most influence. And so some of the major corporate interest groups specifically are realtors, beer and alcohol, health insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, tech companies, and defense contractors.
But as I mentioned, identity politics often fall short when it comes to real systemic change because those class interests aren't shifting. The Ivanka effect, aka when identity politics fail. We are often so unaware of the role that wealth and class play in this country that we are still taught to believe it is an unequivocal success when a person from a more marginalized or underrepresented identity becomes rich themselves. Supposedly, it's a Yas Queen moment whenever any woman succeeds, but so often wealthy women, and wealthy white women in particular, are not the feminist icons we think they are. Let's take a look at the case of Ivanka Trump. Maybe a little music over pictures and videos of Ivanka. Okay. Her public persona during her father's 2016 campaign and subsequent presidency had some quasi-feminist elements. She was a big proponent of maternity leave, and in 2017, on Equal Pay Day, she shared this caption alongside a graph showing pay disparities. Quote, "Closing the gender pay gap is critical to the economic empowerment of American women, and it is the responsibility of all Americans to come together in pursuit of equal pay." But then, in 2018, quote, Democracy Forward filed a lawsuit demanding that President Trump's Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, release records detailing Assistant to the President Ivanka Trump's role in unlawfully rolling back a critical transparency requirement designed to root out pay discrimination and close the wage gap. The suit follows Ivanka Trump's public support for eliminating the protection and empowering over 60,000 employers who collectively employ 63 million workers to continue shielding race and gender pay gaps from scrutiny. Ivanka is a classic Nepo baby and the daughter of another Nepo baby. Everything in her life has been handed to her, and she has no real qualms about perpetuating systems that harm other women because they don't materially affect her, even though you could make the argument that they do affect women like her in other ways. We've talked a lot on this channel about the girl bossification of feminism, and actual feminism and real progress don't mean rallying around the few women in power, because ultimately those ultra-rich women are simply benefiting from the same systems. As we mentioned, one female CEO does not make a difference if she's not actually changing the lives of her female employees. People do not inherently act in the interests of their identities. In fact, when it comes to acting in direct opposition of your own identity groups and what would stand to benefit them, we put together a little yearbook of some public figures who do just that. And on that note, let's get into Chapter 7, Poverty and Race, a Match Made in Hell. So we cannot talk about people not acting or voting in their own interest without talking about the relationship between poverty and white supremacy in the US. Honestly, there's so much to unpack here that I'll leave this topic to the political experts, but we simply cannot talk about poverty in America and in the rest of the Western world without talking about it as a tool for white supremacy. There are many good books on this topic, including White Trash, which is the longest audiobook of my life, but was very worth reading, and recent Society at TFD Book Club pick Poverty by America. As that book points out, there are still policies in place keeping people in poverty that are left over from the era of enslavement. Quote, most states still allow restaurants and other service workers to be paid a sub-minimum wage, which is a meager $2.13 an hour at the federal level, forcing nearly 5 million workers to survive on tips. And where did the concept of a sub-minimum wage come from? It's a vestige of slavery. And an interesting political paradox exists in America, as explained by a recent article in The Atlantic. Quote, the growing tendency of voters to divide between the parties based on cultural attitudes rather than class interests. That dynamic has simultaneously allowed House Democrats to gain more in socially liberal, affluent metropolitan areas, and House Republicans to consolidate their hold over more culturally conservative, economically hardscrabble non-urban areas. Now, it's likely that that many voters generally don't feel their needs are reflected by either primary party, so they're picking what is, in their minds, the lesser of two evils. But for the GOP, who represent a much larger share of lower income and older voters, this means that their constituents may often be voting directly against their own interests. Quote, while Republicans have gained in some areas, primarily around culturally and racially infused disputes, such as those over crime and immigration, a struggle over spending priorities will inevitably highlight that their policies on these bread and butter issues remain diametrically opposed to the economic interests of much of their base, says Paul Pearson, a political scientist at UC Berkeley and a co-author of Let Them Eat Tweets. And most low-income Republican districts are made up of white working-class Americans away from major metropolitan areas, and many of which have some of the highest proportions of Americans without health insurance. Now, we've all likely been aware of this trend, especially after the 2016 presidential election. By fueling racism, xenophobia, etc., they're able to get people to vote against programs they would actually benefit from, like Medicare for all, Social Security, a higher minimum wage, etc. And keeping these people angry and against moving their vote to the DNC, which is increasingly viewed as the party of the rich, works in favor of the GOP and white supremacy. By encouraging an us versus them mentality, they continue to push their voters toward the GOP, who will continue to make cuts and appoint federal judges who actively work against those in poverty.
The bootstraps narrative is essential to our corporatocracy. It is essential that the populace believes the bootstraps narrative, because the corporate ruling class, they are the ones that profit from poverty. They are the ones that profit from extracting value from workers. And so it is very valuable to the corporatocracy if, instead of banding together as workers to fight for what we are owed, if we are fighting with one another about who's taking too much government welfare.
Now, I want to be very clear that the Democrats can catch these hands too. Like, the vast majority of mainstream Democrats do not act in the interest of working Americans. There are a few on the further left edges of the party who are truly working in more working class interests, but the vast majority of the DNC, like the GOP, is serving corporate interests. I don't necessarily think that the solution would be all of these low-income white Americans to move over to the DNC as it exists. But the fact that the redirection of all of this righteous rage at how much we've been left behind by corporatized politics is to move us further and further into an us versus them identity resentment, which leaves lower-income people directly voting against their interests and putting them in even worse economic positions, is such a missed opportunity. The answer to neoliberal corporatist Democrats isn't mask-off conservative hypercapitalism. It's an actual working class politics centered around restoring the American middle class. But perhaps the most effective tool that we have for gaslighting ourselves into a nation that class doesn't really exist as a privilege is what happens, typically, as people get wealthy. Which brings us to our final chapter: why money, or even just the possibility of money, makes people more conservative. Now, I'll just put my cards on the table right here. As I've changed social class, I went from like a libertarian cringe lord in my early 20s to like, I don't know, like to a card-carrying member of the Democratic Socialists slash, you know, I don't know. I'm out here singing the Internationale, baby. Like, I have gotten further and further and further left with each dollar in my pocket. So I guess I'm the exception to this rule, although I think it's becoming more and more the case that people are not changing as radically as they used to. But the point remains, demographically, in general, people typically become more conservative the wealthier they get. And as mentioned in the title, this is also true for even just the possibility of that money, which takes us all the way back to our mentality of being temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
There's a real loneliness that comes with it, because on both ends of that extreme, and they are usually more extreme than I think most people realize, especially if you exist and have always existed on either end of the extreme, is that they both have fantasies about each other. Rich people have a lot of fantasies about what it's like to be poor, and poor people have a lot of fantasies about what it's like to be rich. And they don't really like to have those fantasies interrupted by reality. And whenever I step into a room and start talking about class, I'm kind of the reality. And even if they find it interesting, or even if they are compelled by elements of my story, they still want it to end a certain way, and they don't like when it doesn't. It is really hard when I talk to when I'm in those spaces where, it is prestige industry and the people tend to be wealthy or come from wealthy backgrounds. And I start talking about having an incarcerated parent and watching those brows furrow and the nods and just oh my God, and they always say the same thing, I just can't imagine, I can't imagine. And I'm like, okay, but for me, it's like I don't need to imagine. And not only that, but I come from a community where a lot of people don't have to imagine. Nobody would ever say, I can't imagine. They would say things like, oh man, how long was he in for? Where was he? Yeah, I had an uncle up there. It was it's hard because it's so hard to get up there and it's gas money and they only got visitation days on. And now you're having a conversation about the specifics versus somebody who kind of just it's almost like they see you as like this this orator, this performer who's telling them the tale of these things that happened long ago. And it's like, no, I'm 36. This is this is my life. This is most of my life. But also the people on the other end, the people who come from the more working class, impoverished background, the people who are going to be closer and have more experience with things like having an incarcerated parent, they don't want to hear how many of the rich, wealthy people I know are woefully unhappy, like crazy unhappy. And in a lot of cases, a little bit lazy and a lot of bit stupid. Like people don't want to hear that. They don't want to know that. They want to think, but I see this person with this and that, and they got this and that. And I don't know how to tell them, yeah, because their uncle works in this industry, got them a job interning when they were 13, and they've never done anything else. They know all the people who are hiring for all the jobs, and they're getting them because they're there and they know how to do that job. That one job. They didn't have to be better than you in order to get the job. And I know you really want to think that all you have to do is be better. All you have to do is, work harder and, be smarter, and then you'll have what they have. But baby, that's not how they got it. And they don't want to hear that. So it's quite lonely.
Because Americans are facing the biggest wealth disparity since the Gilded Age, and there are very clearly two Americas. According to The Guardian, after being downgraded on the UN's ranking of countries based on living standards and sustainable development goals, some have even cautioned that the US is becoming a developing country. And anecdotally speaking, there seems to be a rule that as people get richer, they become more concerned with their own needs and less invested in general welfare, i.e., they become more conservative. And there's actually some research-backed evidence of this being the case. Quote, 2 researchers from the United Kingdom say they have proven that having money makes you more conservative and less egalitarian. They studied the political opinions of people who won the lottery over time and found that the larger the lottery win, the more likely the winners are to adopt right-wing views and believe less in society's role in making sure ordinary people get a fair share of society's wealth. The study found that 13% of non-winners favor a more conservative party after playing the lottery, but that 18% of people who won more than £500 joined a right-wing party. Their author concluded that their study confirms what many economists have already suggested, that people's political choices are often motivated by self-interest. And as I mentioned, while previous generations often did become more conservative as they aged, we're simply not seeing the same trend with millennials, perhaps because of the 2008 financial crisis. We're seeing huge demographic shifts with how people align politically as they age and as they earn money, but historically in America, especially when you look at the boomers who are still inexplicably running everything and hoarding all the assets, money is heavily correlated with more conservative attitudes. Not just in terms of left-right politics, but also in terms of how they view broader concepts of community. We've done videos on this channel about how accumulating wealth decreases things like empathy, and perhaps most relevantly, reduces your need to even have community at all. And while there are obviously plenty of Democrats who support tax breaks for the wealthy, this conservative worldview is essentially about seeing the world as increasingly about yourself, with everyone else coming second. And with the myth of the American dream turning any accumulation of wealth into a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that you were more deserving of that wealth to begin with, and the stealth wealth that allows people to obscure what they actually have and pass themselves off as normal even when they're way outside the norm, part of the inherent process of rising in social class in America when it does happen is about being dishonest about how it actually came to be, or what it looks like to be wealthy, or how many advantages you have. We simultaneously glorify wealth and love to see it flashed, but have a total lack of transparency when it comes to how that wealth actually impacts our lives. The bleak reality in America is that the rich are as rich as they are today, and again, our wealth inequality is greater now than during the era of Rockefeller, because the poor are as poor as they are. From Poverty by America. By one estimate, simply collecting unpaid federal income taxes from the top 1% of households would bring in some $175 billion a year. We could just about fill the entire poverty gap in America if the richest among us simply paid the taxes they owed.
One of the differences that actually has come up between us, much more so than race, is class, because we were raised so differently. Kelly is like, for a long time, was like the only kid in his family, like the only, the aunts, the uncles, everybody. He was the only one. He was spending every summer in LA with his aunt, who does not have kids and is not married. She was the president of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. She was teaching him how to sail and taking him out on her boat to the Catalina Islands, where they were jumping off the back of the boat together and swimming in the ocean. She was taking him to Egypt because he wanted to go, where he was getting broken up with by his first girlfriend on a cruise while he was on the Nile. Like he has had these wild experiences, right? The first place he got drunk was Paris. You know what I mean? Like he has just lived this life up until we met that was so extraordinary and so, beautiful, and it was constructed for him. It was what his mother and his aunt wanted from the day he was born, was for him specifically to have all of this access to the world and to knowledge and to everything, which is a big part of the reason why he's who he is and a big part of the reason why I love him. But I did not grow up that way at all. I did not get on a plane until I was 19. And that was to go work at a camp in upstate New York. Man, I lived a completely different existence than him, even when it came down to things that you needed in school or wanted in school. Like, I go to his house and they have his senior photos. I never got to take senior pictures because they cost money. He talks about how, he wanted to letter in school but never lettered. I did letter, but I couldn't afford the jacket. So I have the letter and not the jacket. There were all of these things that, like, it became actually like a massive trigger for me. Like, even just talking to him sometimes about things they had in his school. Him talking about going to the library in his school where they could check out books. We had a library in our school, but we weren't allowed to check out the books. And I know it's wild. It's caused an unraveling, but also like a radicalization a little bit for me when it comes to children and the opportunities that they get, because there were parts of me, I think, that were really holding on to the idea of meritocracy and the idea that the cream really does rise to the top, or that people who work hard and know the most and do the best get opportunities. And our education, because we had been devalued, our education had been reduced. And it still makes me really upset. Obviously, it makes me sad, because I was such a curious kid, and I was a kid with so much energy. I wanted to touch everything. I wanted to read everything. I wanted to know everything, and I kept hitting walls. And it was wild, and continues to be wild, to be in relationship with someone who never saw a ceiling in their whole life.
We will not get to a place of true economic progress in this country until we start to see social class as the identity that it is. Your class in America is just as real as so many other aspects of who you are, and deluding ourselves into thinking that we're all just a few good decisions away from becoming millionaires, or that the rich are rich because they worked harder than everyone else, is keeping us locked in a cycle of inequality. We are an incredibly wealthy nation who could afford to do so much for all of its people. Our middle class used to be the envy of the developed world, but the key word in there is class. And until we start getting some of that chic class consciousness going, nothing will really change. It's only going to get worse. See you next month.